February 11, 1963, 6:43 p.m. Special Agent Robert Wallace sat in an unmarked sedan 3 blocks from the Apollo Theater on 125th Street, listening to radio chatter that confirmed what he had spent 6 months planning. Bumpy Johnson was inside the theater watching a performance, exactly where FBI surveillance had predicted he would be based on his routine patterns. Surrounding the theater were 12 agents positioned at every exit, armed and prepared to execute an arrest warrant on federal conspiracy charges that carried a potential 20-year sentence. The case had been built meticulously: wiretap evidence of gambling operations, financial records documenting unreported income, witness testimony from operators who had been pressured into cooperation. It was the most comprehensive federal case ever assembled against Bumpy Johnson, and Wallace believed it was airtight. The plan was to wait until the performance ended, allow the crowd to disperse, and then approach Bumpy as he exited the theater. Clean arrest, minimal public scene, transport to federal lockup for processing. Except that when the performance ended at 7:35 p.m. and agents moved into position at all exits, Bumpy Johnson did not emerge from any of them. By 8:00 p.m., the theater was empty according to building management, but Bumpy had vanished. By 8:30 p.m., Wallace received a phone call at the field office from an attorney representing Bumpy, informing him that his client would surrender voluntarily the following morning at a time and location of their choosing, and that the FBI's amateur attempt at a surprise arrest had been monitored and circumvented with embarrassing ease. What the FBI did not understand, what they would not piece together until weeks later, was that Bumpy Johnson had known about the arrest warrant for 3 days, had identified the surveillance teams following him, and had walked into the Apollo Theater specifically to demonstrate that federal law enforcement's most sophisticated operation could not catch him when he chose not to be caught. To understand the February 1963 incident, and how Bumpy Johnson evaded an FBI ambush that should have been inescapable, it is necessary to examine both the federal investigation that produced the arrest warrant and the intelligence capabilities Bumpy had developed that gave him systematic advantage over law enforcement despite their superior resources and legal authority. The FBI's investigation of Bumpy Johnson had begun in earnest in August 1962 as part of a broader Justice Department initiative targeting organized crime figures across major American cities. Attorney General Robert Kennedy had made dismantling organized crime a priority, allocating significant resources to building federal cases that could incapacitate criminal leaders through lengthy prison sentences. Bumpy Johnson was identified as a high-value target because of his control over gambling operations in Harlem and his suspected involvement in various other criminal enterprises that generated substantial unreported income. The investigation was assigned to Special Agent Robert Wallace, an experienced organized crime investigator who had successfully prosecuted several Italian mob figures, and who approached the Bumpy Johnson case with confidence that federal resources would overcome whatever defensive capabilities a Harlem numbers operator possessed. The investigation Wallace conducted between August 1962 and February 1963 employed the full range of FBI capabilities available at that time. Wiretaps were installed on telephones Bumpy was known to use, capturing conversations about gambling operations, financial transactions, and organizational management that provided evidence of criminal activity. Physical surveillance teams followed Bumpy and his associates, documenting their movements, meeting locations, and interactions with other criminal operators, and with legitimate business people who might be involved in money laundering. Financial investigators analyzed bank records, real estate transactions, and business ownership structures to identify assets that appeared inconsistent with Bumpy's reported income and that suggested large-scale tax evasion. Informants were cultivated within Harlem's criminal community, including several lower-level operators who were arrested on separate charges and offered reduced sentences in exchange for testimony about Bumpy's organization. By January 1963, Wallace believed he had assembled a prosecutable case. The wiretap evidence documented Bumpy's direct involvement in managing gambling operations that were clearly illegal under federal law. The financial evidence showed a pattern of unreported income and asset purchases that could support tax evasion charges carrying significant prison time. The witness testimony, while coming from individuals whose credibility could be challenged, provided corroboration for the technical evidence, and offered insider perspective on how Bumpy's organization functioned. Wallace presented the case to federal prosecutors in late January, and on February 4, 1963, a grand jury issued an indictment charging Bumpy Johnson with conspiracy to operate illegal gambling enterprises and with multiple counts of federal tax evasion. An arrest warrant was issued the same day, and Wallace began planning the tactical operation to take Bumpy into custody. The arrest plan Wallace developed reflected standard FBI procedure for apprehending organized crime figures who might resist or attempt to flee. Rather than attempting to arrest Bumpy at his residence, which could result in a hostage situation or armed confrontation if Bumpy chose to resist, Wallace decided to arrest him in a public location where the presence of civilians would make violent resistance unlikely, and where Bumpy would be separated from his security personnel and organizational support. Surveillance had identified that Bumpy attended performances at the Apollo Theater regularly on Tuesday and Friday evenings, often arriving alone or with minimal escort. The theater's layout provided multiple exits that could be covered by positioning agents around the building's perimeter, making escape seemingly impossible once Bumpy was inside. Wallace selected Tuesday, February 11th as the arrest date and assembled a team of 12 agents to execute the operation. What Wallace did not know was that Bumpy Johnson had been aware of the federal investigation since its inception in August 1962 and had been receiving detailed updates about its progress through multiple intelligence sources that had been developed over years of careful cultivation. Bumpy's intelligence network included contacts within law enforcement who provided information for various reasons. Some were corrupt and accepted payments. Others were ideologically sympathetic to Bumpy's role in Harlem and viewed him as less harmful than the alternatives. Others were manipulated through blackmail or other leverage that Bumpy's organization had developed. The network also included seemingly legitimate community members who had access to law enforcement information through their employment or social connections, and who passed that information to Bumpy because of loyalty, financial incentive, or personal relationships with members of his organization. Through this intelligence network, Bumpy learned about the wiretaps within days of their installation, allowing him to modify his communication patterns to avoid discussing sensitive matters on compromised phones. He learned about the financial investigation in time to restructure certain asset holdings and to create documentary evidence that would complicate the government's ability to prove tax evasion. He learned about the pressure being applied to potential witnesses, allowing him to either reinforce their loyalty through support and incentives, or to develop impeachment evidence that would undermine their credibility if they chose to testify. Most critically, Bumpy learned about the arrest warrant on February 8th, 3 days before the planned operation, giving him time to prepare a response that would demonstrate his intelligence capabilities while minimizing the actual legal consequences of the indictment. Bumpy's decision to walk into the FBI's ambush rather than avoiding the Apollo Theater entirely was strategic rather than reckless. He understood that the arrest warrant would eventually be executed regardless of what he did on February 11th, and that evading arrest long-term would create fugitive charges that would complicate any legal defense and would consume resources in avoiding capture that could be better used addressing the underlying criminal charges. However, Bumpy also understood that how he was arrested would send important messages to multiple audiences. If he was arrested in the manner the FBI planned, surrounded by agents at a theater exit, processed in front of whatever media coverage the FBI arranged, appearing as a helpless target of federal law enforcement, it would project weakness that could undermine his authority within his own organization, and could encourage rivals to challenge his position during whatever period he spent fighting the charges or serving a sentence if convicted. The alternative, demonstrating that he could evade the FBI's most sophisticated arrest operation, and then surrender on his own terms, would project strength and competence that would reinforce his authority and would humiliate federal law enforcement in ways that might create advantages in subsequent legal proceedings. The escape plan Bumpy implemented required detailed knowledge of the Apollo Theater's layout, including features that were not apparent from standard architectural plans or from casual observation. The theater had been constructed in the 1910s and had undergone multiple renovations that had created various access points and passages that building management did not necessarily advertise, and that might not be documented in official records. Bumpy had cultivated a relationship with one of the theater's maintenance supervisors years earlier, providing financial support when the supervisor's family faced medical expenses, and generally maintaining the kind of reciprocal relationship that characterized Bumpy's approach to community engagement. Through this relationship, Bumpy had detailed knowledge of the theater's internal structure, including a service corridor that connected the theater to an adjacent building, and that had been created during a 1940s renovation to facilitate equipment deliveries and staff movement. On February 11, 1963, Bumpy entered the Apollo Theater at approximately 6:15 p.m., purchased a ticket, and took a seat in the balcony section where he could observe the performance and monitor the theater's exits. He had been informed by his intelligence sources that FBI surveillance teams were positioning around the building, and that the arrest would be attempted when he exited after the performance ended. At 7:20 p.m., approximately 15 minutes before the performance concluded, Bumpy left his seat and made his way to a backstage area using routes that his maintenance contact had described. He accessed the service corridor, passed through to the adjacent building, exited onto 126th Street rather than 125th Street, where the FBI teams were concentrated, and entered a vehicle that had been positioned by associates who had been briefed on the escape plan. By the time FBI agents realized that Bumpy had not emerged from any monitored exit, he was already 10 blocks away and moving toward a location where he would remain for the next 12 hours while his attorney initiated contact with federal authorities. The phone call Wallace received at 8:30 p.m. from Bumpy's attorney was professionally courteous but conveyed unmistakable mockery. Attorney Harold Friedman informed Wallace that his client was aware of the arrest warrant and the charges, that he would surrender voluntarily the following morning at 10:00 a.m. at the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan, and that the FBI's attempt to execute a surprise arrest had been noted with interest by his client, who looked forward to discussing the matter with prosecutors. The call was brief, but its implications were significant. Bumpy had known about the arrest operation in advance, had identified and evaded the FBI's surveillance and tactical positioning, and was now controlling the terms of his surrender rather than being taken into custody according to the FBI's plan. The surrender that occurred on February 12th at 10:00 a.m. was choreographed to maximize Bumpy's control over the narrative and minimize the visual impact that would have resulted from an arrest executed according to FBI planning. Bumpy arrived at the federal courthouse with his attorney, dressed in an expensive suit that projected dignity and authority rather than the disheveled appearance that often characterized arrested suspects. He was accompanied by several community leaders and ministers who had agreed to appear with him as a demonstration of support and legitimacy. Media coverage that Bumpy's organization had arranged showed him walking into the courthouse calmly and confidently, surrendering himself voluntarily rather than being captured by law enforcement. The optics conveyed strength and control rather than weakness and defeat, which was exactly the message Bumpy intended to send to everyone watching: his organization, his rivals, his community, and the federal government. The FBI's internal response to the February 11th incident reflected both embarrassment about the operational failure and concern about the implications of Bumpy having known about the arrest warrant in advance. Wallace prepared a detailed after-action report analyzing what had gone wrong, focusing initially on tactical mistakes in the theater operation, insufficient coverage of all possible exits, failure to position agents inside the theater to maintain visual contact with the target, inadequate contingency planning for scenarios where the target evaded the perimeter. However, the deeper and more troubling conclusion the FBI reached was that Bumpy had received advance information about the investigation and arrest plan from sources that had not been identified, despite the Bureau's counterintelligence procedures. This suggested that Bumpy's intelligence network had penetrated law enforcement to a degree that made traditional investigative methods potentially compromised. The FBI initiated an internal investigation to identify potential leaks that could have informed Bumpy about the arrest warrant. The investigation examined everyone who had access to information about the Bumpy Johnson case, including agents, support staff, prosecutors, court personnel, and anyone else who might have known about the February 11th arrest plan. Polygraph examinations were administered to personnel who had direct access to sensitive information. Phone records and financial transactions were reviewed for evidence of unauthorized contacts or suspicious payments. The investigation continued for several months and identified several individuals who had engaged in activities that raised concerns, but it never definitively identified the specific source or sources that had informed Bumpy about the arrest warrant. The failure to identify the leak reinforced the FBI's assessment that Bumpy's intelligence capabilities were more sophisticated than they had previously understood, and that future operations would need to be planned with the assumption that information might be compromised. The legal proceedings following Bumpy's February 12th surrender demonstrated both the strength of the federal case that Wallace had assembled and the defensive capabilities that Bumpy's legal team could deploy. The conspiracy and tax evasion charges were serious and were supported by substantial evidence that prosecutors believed would survive defense challenges. However, Bumpy's attorneys, led by Harold Friedman, mounted an aggressive defense that challenged the admissibility of wiretap evidence on constitutional grounds, attacked the credibility of witness testimony by exposing the incentives witnesses had been offered in exchange for cooperation, and created reasonable doubt about whether the financial transactions in question constituted criminal tax evasion or were simply business dealings that had been improperly documented. The legal battle extended through most of 1963 and into early 1964, consuming significant prosecutorial resources and generating mixed results in preliminary hearings that suggested the outcome at trial was uncertain. In April 1964, federal prosecutors offered a plea agreement that would resolve the case without trial. Bumpy would plead guilty to reduced charges carrying a sentence of 5 years, with the understanding that he would likely serve approximately 3 years with good behavior. The agreement eliminated the risk of a longer sentence if he was convicted at trial on all original charges, and it allowed both sides to avoid the expense and uncertainty of a lengthy trial. Bumpy accepted the plea agreement, calculating that 3 years in federal prison was an acceptable cost given the alternative of potentially 15 to 20 years if trial went badly. He began serving his sentence in July 1964 and was released in early 1967, returning to Harlem to resume control of his organization, which had been managed by trusted associates during his incarceration. The strategic significance of the February 1963 incident extended beyond the immediate operational outcome. The FBI's failure to arrest Bumpy according to plan and his successful evasion followed by controlled surrender became part of his legend within Harlem and within organized crime circles more broadly. The incident demonstrated that Bumpy possessed intelligence capabilities that allowed him to monitor and counter law enforcement operations despite the FBI's resources and authority. It showed that he could control narratives and optics even in situations where he was technically being arrested and prosecuted. It reinforced the perception that he was multiple steps ahead of opponents and authorities who underestimated his organizational sophistication. These perceptions contributed to Bumpy's authority and deterred challenges during the period when he was fighting the federal charges and during his subsequent incarceration, because potential rivals understood that someone who could outmaneuver the FBI would certainly be able to outmaneuver them. For federal law enforcement, the February 1963 incident became a case study in the limitations of traditional investigative methods against targets who had developed sophisticated counterintelligence capabilities. The FBI's subsequent approach to organized crime investigations incorporated lessons learned from the Bumpy Johnson case, including enhanced operational security procedures, more careful vetting of personnel who had access to sensitive information, and tactical planning that assumed targets might have advance warning of law enforcement actions. The incident also contributed to FBI thinking about the relationship between organized crime figures and their communities, recognizing that operators like Bumpy who maintained genuine community support could leverage those relationships to develop intelligence networks that penetrated institutions, including law enforcement, in ways that purely predatory criminals could not replicate. Understanding how Bumpy Johnson walked out of the FBI's February 1963 ambush requires recognizing that the incident was the culmination of years of systematic intelligence development, rather than a single clever escape plan. Bumpy had invested in relationships, had cultivated sources, had built redundancy into his information networks so that he received intelligence through multiple independent channels that could be cross-verified. He had studied law enforcement procedures and capabilities so that he understood what tactics would be employed and what vulnerabilities those tactics contained. He had prepared contingency plans for various scenarios so that when the arrest warrant was issued, he had options immediately available rather than needing to improvise under pressure. The Apollo Theater escape was impressive tactically, but it was the intelligence foundation that made the tactic possible, and that foundation had been built through patient, careful work over many years. That approach to intelligence as a strategic priority rather than an operational afterthought distinguished Bumpy from most criminal operators and explains much of his success in maintaining his position despite facing opponents with superior conventional resources.